"Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." Now, when Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address in the fall after the most horrible and resounding and important battle of the Civil War that took place in July of 1863, he is giving forth a new birth of freedom for the United States. And Lincoln says, for both the Union, the North, his United States of America, and for the Confederacy, the South, all sides are declaring their cause is liberty, that both sides say they're fighting for freedom, fighting for what they say is the spirit of 1776, the spirit of the American Revolution, the spirit of freedom. But in using the same word, freedom, we do not all mean the same thing. To the North, freedom meant each man enjoying the product of his own labor. To the South, to white Southerners, it meant mastership, the power to do as they pleased with other men and the product of other men's labor. I think that's a really important thing as you're reading through your book, what they fought for to understand. So it's often said that the Civil War in the 1860s is the second American Revolution. Okay, never mind that the War of 1812 was, that's the Revenge of the Empire. That's the Empire Strikes Back. Excuse me, Star Wars reference. But this is, like Lincoln says in the Gettysburg Address, a new birth for freedom. America, its political situation, its economic situation, its social situation are all going to be transformed almost completely by this war. Economically, we go from a nation that had never had, legal tender currency to the greenbacks as the way, to heavy tariffs, and growing industry, and a national commerce that can almost equalize a debt that would be racked up with over $2 million in back then money being spent per day, like a crazy high amount of money. The Union spent every day financing the war, but it was more than paid off by the capital of northern farms and businesses and corporations that developed during this war. So economically, a huge transformation for the United States. And societally, socially, obviously, the biggest impact is going to be that over 4 million African Americans will be freed at the end of the war with the 13th Amendment. Don't forget the Emancipation Proclamation. It only technically freed the slaves. Lincoln had no power to actually free because it only freed the slaves that were behind Confederate lines in Confederate occupied territory in the South. This was done as a political maneuver, but it changed the scope and the nature of the war. And that's what Lincoln talks about in his Gettysburg Address. If you go on to see, he says in the second paragraph, "Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Can we survive? Can we stay together? We are met on a great battlefield of that war." This is the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863 in Pennsylvania in the North. This is Lee's second time trying to invade the North, and he is repulsed. "We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this." Lincoln is there to give the address commemorating the opening of the Gettysburg Cemetery, the first national cemetery, because there were over 50,000 casualties from the Battle of Gettysburg, and you needed to bury those bodies quickly and orderly in order to prevent more disease from spreading. So the creation of the national cemetery system was needed. But in a larger sense, Lincoln says, "We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have fought here, have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Remember, in January of 1863, January 1st, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, and Lincoln changed the nature of the war. Maybe it was mostly done politically to keep Britain and France from offering wholesale alliance to the Confederacy, because they couldn't, in right conscience, fully support a slave power versus a power that was fighting to end slavery. But it also seems like Lincoln is evolving throughout the course of the war. His own reasons are changing, and that of the North changes with him. That this began as a war to keep the Union together, to preserve the United States of America as a whole country. And it becomes, through the Emancipation Proclamation and through the Gettysburg Address, a war to truly have what Thomas Jefferson spelled out in the Declaration of Independence, a place where all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with unalienable rights that no government could take away, to basically free the slaves, and beyond that, to maybe grant them equality in suffrage. So that's the importance of the Gettysburg Address. It changes the motivation of the war. It solidifies, at least from Lincoln, from the presidents of the United States, the motivation of the North in this war. And keep in mind, that's over halfway through this thing. That's in the fall of 1863. All right. Now I was waxing poetic about Lincoln. Let me say some bad stuff about him. Lincoln was a brilliant politician, masterful manipulator, and had a wonderful way with words. Every single speech that Lincoln gave, there's always something to quote from. He is the first Republican president of a Republican Party that, when it was founded, meant to end and stop the spread of slavery, and eventually, because of his and radical Republicans' efforts during and after the war, meant to achieve equality for African Americans. So these are all noble things. And not going directly against that, but during the war, Lincoln does do some stuff as well that could be considered less noble. In those border states, so on the map here, that's Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia was part of Virginia. It's going to split apart in 1861 at the beginning of the war. The Hill people, they're living in the Appalachia region of Virginia, did not support the war, much like the Hill people in northern Georgia did not support the war, and almost caused Georgia not to secede. But luckily for West Virginia, they're right there next to the Union. So they do break apart from the rest of Virginia instead of following. And that's how you have the creation of that state of West Virginia. But Maryland and Delaware, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, these border states had slavery, yet they were part of the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation did not affect the slaves living in those places as long as their masters stayed loyal to the Union. Because remember, Lincoln greatly feared losing those border states. They had very large white populations. They would greatly assist the South if they turned sides. Okay. But again, he can't risk losing them. And after the Emancipation Proclamation, many of those slave owners are seeing their days are numbered. What are they going to do? Well, they're probably going to revolt and try to switch sides. So this is where Lincoln famously is going to arrest anybody who is kind of speaking out or violating any of those sedition type laws. Okay. Which violates the First Amendment. You're supposed to have freedom of speech, but if you speak out or if you're trying to foment insurrection in these border states, you would be arrested and thrown in jail, no trials. And basically by doing that, he's doing what we call suspending the writ of habeas corpus, which is fancy Latin legal terminology for saying he suspended the rule of law. law and order do not count during the war. They're put on like a timeout. And these border states, in some places, go under like martial law from Union forces to keep them in the country, to keep them part of the North. So there was that going on. And this is an interesting thing that we're going to see repeated often in American wars, that during times of conflict, during times of terrorism or straight out war, the government, and this is through prior precedent from, here at Lincoln with the suspension of habeas corpus, and we'll see in the Schenck versus U.S. trial in World War I with the Japanese internment during World War II. We'll see with the Patriot Act after 9/11 and the Twin Towers being destroyed by terrorists from Al Qaeda. During all these events, the government takes away people's rights. Citizens' rights do not count during times of conflict. They can be taken away. This is what they called in the Schenck case, clear and present danger. If government feels like national security is being threatened, it will think nothing of taking away our individual rights, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of privacy, and so on. Or freedom for privacy, I should say, Fourth Amendment. All right, so that's some of the stuff happening. In 1862, two very important laws. The Homestead Act is going to be passed, and this is the culmination of the Republican dream. This is what Republicans really, really wanted to have happen, to stop the spread of slavery. Why? Well, it was for each poor white man to enjoy the product of his labor. He needed to have land. Where was land available? It was available out west. Go west, young man, right? And so the Homestead Act, please highlight in your notes, put a star. We're going to talk a lot about this in 1302. The Homestead Act is going to grant 160 acres out west, mostly in the Great Plains region. You can see on the map I'm highlighting, okay? 160 acres to each individual family. Government charters this land almost for free, okay? Basically, I think it was like $1.25 an acre or something. It was virtually for free, super cheap land out west, granted by the government in these 160-acre tracts, and all these families would have to do in order to own their 160-acre homestead, which would be like a farm with a little house on it where they could, grow food for themselves. Jefferson's vision realized is they had to, within 5 years, build that homestead, which you can see in the picture there is not any house, it's that fancy. It's made out of thatch. Like, there's not a lot of trees at this time out in the Great Plains, so mostly going to be mud and straw. Okay, so build a homestead house and then a farm. You cultivate the land. If you do those two things, you build your house and you farm, within 5 years, you get to keep all that land, again, virtually for free. So that is the Homestead Act. And over 400,000 families, so over 1 million people, most of them immigrants, most of them very poor white families, will move out west. Now, why does Lincoln do this in the middle of the Civil War? Well, three main things. I said already, this is a major dream come true for the Republican Party, for their free soil inclinations. This is what they wanted to begin with, okay? B, now that the South had left Congress, those Southern senators and Southern representatives are no longer part of Congress. They went down to the Confederacy. The North has kind of a free reign. The Republican Party has a pretty sizable majority in both houses of Congress. There are still some Northern Democrats, and we'll talk more about them in the re-election campaign in 1864, where it's McClellan versus Lincoln. McClellan wasn't just going softly into that good night. But yeah, basically now it's easy for the Republican Party to pass legislation. They don't have that Southern Democratic opposition anymore. And thirdly, okay, all of these homesteads are about cultivating the land, right? It's one of the things you have to do. You had to farm. Where do you think they're going to sell a lot of their surplus, like crops and food? Oh, to the North, to the Union, and that could help supply more food. So economically, agriculturally, This is going to be a major, major win for the United States. That's the Homestead Act. It will settle the Great Plains. It will cause a lot of problems for Native Americans, obviously. But this is what wins the West, basically. It brings large numbers of settlers out to tame and settle the West. Going along with the Homestead Act, you also have the Morrill Land Grant Act, which you should probably write down. Morrill. Morrill Land Grant Act is going to set up a fund for the creation of agricultural schools. And by agricultural schools, I mean engineering and agricultural science universities, state universities. From the sale of land grants, money would go to the founding of these colleges in almost every state of the country at this point. They're going to have the founding of these colleges from this Land Grant Act, Morrill Land Grant Act in 1862. And among those in 1862 that was founded was Texas A&M University, because what does A&M stand for? It's Agricultural and Mechanical College. So that's pretty significant. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about is the railroads. Okay, a lot is made about the Transcontinental Railroad. You can see on the map here that it is the first railroad that is going to go across the entire continent of North America, from America's East Coast to the West Coast. Ends up in San Francisco Bay, San Fran Harbor. That's where the Golden Gate Bridge will eventually be built. Now, this was another thing that's going to support all the other things we're talking about with Lincoln and the Republicans and what they want. They want to bring settlers out to the West. You know, they got these homesteads now going on. How do you do that? Well, with the railroad, with the train. Okay. So this is part of that larger picture. And again, with Congress now being firmly in Republican hands, without that Southern Democrat opposition, they can put the railroad wherever they please. They don't have to worry about trying to find a Southern route. Now, that was the whole reason why President Pierce is going to, for $10 million back in the day, purchase the Gadsden lands there from Santa Ana, from Mexico. Again, for $10 million, because they were thinking about doing a southern transcontinental route. That's what the South wanted. Hey, but now the South left, so they're going to have a northern transcontinental route. And this is the first time since the creation of the National Bank that the government is going to charter its own corporations to do this. It charters the Union Pacific Corporation and the Central Pacific Corporation to basically build this transcontinental railroad. And as far as government-created, government-funded projects go, they're going to give a lot of resources to this. Later on, under the Grant administration, we'll talk about a huge railroad scandal tied to this, the Credit Mobilier scandal. But right now, under Lincoln, just know that hundreds of millions of acres is going to be given. All this land here is going to be given to the railroads to help finance this. And they're going to have large numbers of immigrants, like Irish immigrants, building the Union Pacific side out to the Rocky Mountains, and many Chinese immigrants called coolies, very derogatorily by white Americans. These Chinese immigrants will build the Central Pacific Railroad going east from California to the Rockies, where they meet at Promontory Point, Utah, and complete the railroad in 1869. So it began in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War, and it's completed 1869. And once it's linked, now you don't have to spend, months going around the tip of South America, because there's no Panama Canal yet, in order to get from East Coast to West Coast. Now it just takes literally less than a week, and you can go across the country, linking people, ideas, goods, trade. And of course, we own California. Also, now you can trade with the Pacific Islands. It also opens up our interest in places such as Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, and of course, trade as far as China or Japan. All right. All right, Mr. Lincoln, let's get to that. Like I said, there is huge economic changes happening in America during the Civil War. For the South, the Confederacy, they are going to struggle economically. Most of the Southerners, their bank accounts were, guess where? They were in the North. So the South really is strapped for cash. That's why they end up printing off Confederate money, leading to hyperinflation in the South. Their money was worthless. Confederate money was worthless. The Union will also deal with inflation, because they will famously print off the first, basically legal tender. And legal tender, again, a definition for that, it's money that must be accepted for nearly all public and private payments and debts. This is the first time that the government is issuing something like this. It's the foundation of our fiat paper money that we use to this day. Now it's going to be temporary, and then we'll go back to the gold standard and all this other stuff that we have. But the greenbacks, as they were called, was a revolutionary new idea in financing and money for this time. And the Union prints off more than 400 million of these paper notes, these greenbacks. I think the Treasury Secretary, but the guy who creates the idea for this and issues it under Lincoln's government, I think his name was Green or something, or his favorite color. Anyway, so that's why it becomes the greenbacks, and that's why today, like, money's always the color green. The union's also going to borrow more than $2 billion. Now it's going to try to make back some of this by creating what we call war bonds, which is where the government actually encourages its citizens to buy up the government's debt. And so private citizens loan money to the government, which then the government must pay back, including interest. So it was a way for you to invest in your country, and maybe at the end of the war, even help yourself out a little bit, get a little extra back. And this idea of war bonds will be very critical as we get into like the world wars in our 1302 class. The Union will also increase tariffs to unprecedented new heights. You remember, this is something that the North always wanted. And again, now the South isn't there in Congress, so they're free to pass these giant tariffs. Of course, that's going to make trade more difficult, but who's got the industry? It's the North. So what this really does is put even more emphasis on Northern industry, protecting it, allowing it to grow and flourish. So the North, already financially, economically more stable and diversified than the South, will see some more profiteering and some economic benefits come from the North. And even though many of these gains and changes might be temporary, we'll see them, go back or whatever, the government will never be the same again. It will be a very large force during the war, and it's changed. All right, talking about women in the Civil War. For many Northern women, the conflict opened new doors to opportunities. A lot of women took advantage of the wartime labor shortages and actually moved into jobs in factories and into certain, what had been largely male professions, particularly nursing. In the Civil War is when you get the actual beginning of the Red Cross, and you have a nursing corps that was headed by, remember, Dorothea Dix, a woman. The expansion of the activities of the national government opened new jobs for women also as clerks in government offices, writing letters. In fact, that was most of the Civil War nurses did, is they wrote letters home for the sick and injured troops that were unable to. They wrote the letters home. Many of these wartime gains were short-lived, though. Keep in mind that it's temporary and that women are going to go back to the domestic sphere, back to the homes when the war is over. We won't see this again until briefly in World War I, but America's only going to be involved in World War I from basically 1970 to 1918. So really, we don't see it again on this level until World War II, way into the 1940s. But there are some permanent gains during the Civil War, like in white collar government jobs, again, as like secretaries, in retail sales positions, selling stuff, And in nursing in particular, women found a permanent place in the workforce. And remember, with like Horace Mann, opportunities for women had already opened up in the century for like education, for teaching. Hundreds of thousands of Northern women also took part in organizations that gathered money and medical supplies for soldiers, and sent things like books, clothing, and food to freedmen. The U.S. Sanitary Commission emerged as a centralized national relief agency to coordinate donations, and women organized sanitary fairs, grand bazaars that displayed military stuff and sold goods in order to raise money for soldiers' assistance. Um, a lot of women volunteer and do their part during the war, from the North, from nursing with like Clara Barton, who will become the head of the National Red Cross, and many women who organized these sanitary fairs and did their part to raise funding. Many women who, had to basically do with less, or sewed uniforms for troops, or worked in factories to help the war effort. Women will do their part in the North, and many will have to make sacrifices. But I think it's the sacrifices of Southern women that are probably even more important to the effect of the war, because Southern women had unprecedented burdens placed on them that Northern women did not. Because remember, most of the fighting is taking place in the South. All right. And so, and also you have a much smaller white population in the South. So a lot more of the farm boys, a lot more of the men folk are having to go off to war in the South. And that's leaving behind, back on the plantations and on the farms, these Southern women. They were forced to manage the business affairs and discipline slaves. Previously, these were the responsibility of the men. Now, as in the North, women in the South are going to mobilize to support soldiers in the field, and they stepped out of their traditional role as the housewife and the domestic sphere in order to run commercial establishments, sanitary fairs, and work in arms factories. In Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, government girls, as they were called, staffed many of the clerkships in the new Confederate bureaucracy. So again, working those like secretarial positions. But all Confederate women struggled to cope as their loved ones were drawn off into the war. Um, Lacking the aid of slave labor, many of these women found that the absence of their husbands from their previously self sufficient farms made it impossible to feed their families. And you have huge hunger strikes, starvation happening throughout the South, which is ironic. I mean, right? It's an agricultural society. One of the dominant agricultural societies of the world was the American South. And yet, here these people are starving to death. Because they didn't have the labor, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember that over a third of the African Americans in some of the most highly enslaved areas of the South will run away. They'll leave these farms, they'll leave these plantations, and there's nobody to raise food. Not to mention that any Union army that comes through is immediately going to be seizing any of the food that it comes across. Confederate Army as well had this practice of impressment. Remember, we talked about that with the War of 1812, how the British Army, the British Navy, excuse me, would board American ships and kidnap American sailors and draft them into the British Navy for their own use. So this impressment during the Civil War is similar. They're seizing Southern farms and their crops, Southern livestock, pigs, cows, horses, sheep, whatever they needed. The army seized it. Their own army took these things. And not to mention, remember things like the 20 Negro rule, the 20 slave rule, that basically said that if your plantation, if you owned more than 20 slaves, then you were exempt from service. You didn't have to be part of the military. These things, like the impressment of Confederate farms and the 20 Negro rule, these provide an enormous amount of resentment. And then coupled with the fact that you have all these white women in the South who are left on their own with their children, with no means to raise any food, starving to death. They lead these huge strikes, these huge riots. Basically, they become in many southern cities, including Mobile, Alabama, Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. And meanwhile, all these women are writing home to their men who are off at war, saying, their situation, that hey, honey, we're starving to death. We're gonna die if you don't come back. I mean, these men had been the breadwinners, being the farmers, growing the food that the family needed to survive. Most Southern whites did not own slaves, or if they did, it was just a few. Or most Southern whites were middle class, poor, yeoman farmers. Okay, and with all these men off to war, that's a very bleak situation. So this growing disaffection, this growing resentment and starvation, and abject terror, basically, that Southern white women were going through, that they conveyed in letters to their loved ones back on the front in the fighting. It's seen as maybe one of the contributing causes of the civilian morale in the South, one of the reasons that encourages desertion at such a high rate in the Confederate Army. Over 100,000 rebels, 100,000 Confederates actually desert. They leave the military, go back to their families, because their families were starving and dying. So that's something to consider. The North had its share of riots as well, such as very famously in New York City. In July 1863, the introduction of the draft in the North, because remember, they don't have their first draft until 1863, provoked 4 days of rioting in New York City. The mob, composed largely of Irish immigrants, assaulted symbols of the new order being created by the Civil War. They assaulted draft offices, the mansion of wealthy Republicans, industrial establishments, and the city's Black population. This was right after the Emancipation Proclamation. They're blaming Blacks for what was happening. Many of whom, these Blacks that were being targeted, they fled to New Jersey or tried to take refuge in Central Park. Lincoln's going to have to send the Union Army, some of them away from their engagement with the Confederates, up to New York City to finally stop the draft riots taking place there, but not before over 100 people were already killed, and several Blacks lynched in downtown Manhattan, like you can see in the illustration there. There was resentment and disaffection in the North as well. It wasn't just in the South. There were deserters, of course, in the North, but remember, they have a much larger population. Those that were most likely to dissent with the North, like in the draft right here, were many of the Catholic immigrants. They saw themselves as being targeted in the draft because of the exemptions that could take place. They did not apply to any of those exemptions, and you could also, buy your way out of being drafted, which if you're a poor immigrant, you weren't going to be able to do. So that fueled Northern resentment against the war. Now, the antebellum era is what we call the South, when it's in its heyday of the plantations producing these large cash crops with slave-based labor. That's the antebellum South. The Confederacy, like I've said, has a big problem because they are a system of government which honors the states' rights mantra of each of its individual states. So it gives more power to the state governments than to the national authority, but yet they're fighting a very large centralized nation in the United States. And so they never really work out a good way to reconcile those two issues, those two contradicting issues there. Jefferson Davis and his government are actually going to try something pretty bold after Lincoln thwarts their efforts to form an alliance with Britain and France because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Jeff Davis and the Republicans actually, or sorry, Jeff Davis and the Confederacy, they actually try to do an embargo. They actually try to halt the exportation of cotton to the world markets. So they're not going to sell. It's an embargo. They're not going to sell any cotton to England or France. They hoped that by doing this, by starving England and France a little bit of their cotton, that it would force those nations to realize how dependent they were on the South, and thus, again, maybe enter into that military alliance. Britain was already providing through sale most of the Confederacy's navy, and they hoped with a British alliance that they would actually get British troops on the ground, maybe actually more of the Royal British Navy to end the Union Anaconda Plan, the Union blockade, and maybe even in the Confederates' wildest dreams, get the British to launch a second front invasion from Canada to really divert the northern efforts and force the North to a peace. Obviously, none of this manifests, and it actually ends up backfiring terribly. Cotton production right before the Civil War was at like 5 million bales a year. At the end of the Civil War, it's down to less than 250,000 bales per year. And when they do this embargo, cotton just kind of stacked up. Prices hit rock bottom. So it's gonna hurt the Southern economy more than it was already hurting. Remember all that hyperinflation, their money is just being printed off. It's worthless cash that they have down in the South. People are starving, like we just talked about with the women and the food riots down in southern cities. You have this resentment because of the 20 Negro rule, and then Britain doesn't care that the South is withholding cotton. They don't care because, now they can shift their cotton imports from somewhere new. And so Britain then, as a result of this, puts emphasis on getting cotton from its colonies in Egypt and in India, who become major exporters of cotton, basically picking up the slack where the South left off. So this King Cotton diplomacy, the South trying to use cotton as a means to secure military alliances and foreign affairs, it backfires completely. And again, Lincoln headed off a formal alliance that was brewing between the South and Britain and France with the Emancipation Proclamation. He makes this war about slavery. He pictures and paints the South as the slave-based empire that it was versus the North, which was fighting as a force to liberate the slaves. Literally, the North. Lincoln made the North a force for freedom and liberation. We have talked a lot about this. There is a beautiful Southern plantation home, but yeah, a rich man's war and a poor man's fight in both the North and the South. Remember the 20 Negro provision that's sowed so much resentment throughout the South and caused a lot of the desertion among those 100,000 plus Southerners. We actually talked about all that. Okay. So real quickly, I want to wrap up this lecture. I know I'm probably going long. I usually do. I'm sorry, guys. Chancellorsville, fought in April to May of 1863, is going to be where General Robert E. Lee defeats General Fightin' Tom Hooker's Army of the Potomac. By the way, Lincoln has a new commander of the Army of the Potomac. He's constantly searching for the right general, right? Lee, this was a pretty impressive victory. Lee was outnumbered, like basically 2-1 by the Northerners, yet still manages to win the field. And so Chancellorsville was a huge Confederate victory, but it should be noted that there was a strategic problem there at the end for the Confederacy, and that was that one of Lee's most able, brilliant generals, Stonewall Jackson, was killed during the fight. Now, he wasn't killed by enemy rifle or anything. Stonewall Jackson was out scouting the battlefield, and it was dusk when he returned back to his encampment. And the guards he had stationed there, they didn't recognize Jackson, and before he could announce his arrival and who he was, they fired at him, thinking that he was a Union scout. And so he was actually hit in his arm by friendly fire, by his own troops. and he took about a week to die. They even amputated his left arm, and gangrene set in. These amputations back during the Civil War were nasty business. And it was famous quote from General Lee, but he basically says, after Jackson's death, Lee says, Jackson might have lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. He lost his right-hand man. It was Jackson that made the big turning point at Chancellorsville. It was Jackson right at the beginning of the war who made the big turning points at the Battle of Bull Run. Look at Jackson standing like a stone wall. All right, so Vicksburg and the Battle of Fort Hudson are going to be critical for securing the Mississippi River and the Mississippi Valley and the state of Mississippi, and for the Union forces to be moving west. And they split the Confederacy in two. So this is Grant's huge victory, with his right-hand man, William Tecumseh Sherman. Grant and Sherman, they win in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Along the Mississippi River, and capturing Vicksburg right at the end on July 4th, Independence Day. This was coming. News of this victory out west came at the same time as victory in Gettysburg. These were huge turning points, because now with control of the Mississippi River, with Vicksburg and the victory at Fort Hudson, and the capture of 30,000 Confederate forces, and the victory over here out west, now the South is in two. Now the South doesn't have access to most of its supply that it was getting of a lot of troops, most of its meat, most of its cattle, a lot of its horses. A lot of that was coming from Texas, and now Texas is cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. Louisiana is cut off. Louisiana is going to be mostly under Union control. At this point, most of Tennessee is under Union control. So Vicksburg was a huge victory, and this is also going to cement Grant as the most successful Union general, leading to his promotion to the head general for the Union. All right, and then we get to Gettysburg. This is almost like Antietam Part 2, like same motivations here. General Lee in summer of 1863 is going to try to do exactly what he tried to do in the fall of 1862 at Antietam. Antietam was in Maryland. Gettysburg is going to be fought in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This is pretty far up north. But again, Lee has the same objectives. He wants to live off the land, because the Confederate Army is starving and they need resources badly. So Lee wants to go into the north, raid as many northern farms, and impress as many northern livestock, animals, crops, food as he can. Do the same kind of stuff that the Union and the Confederate Army was doing down in the South, wreaking havoc on northern farms as southern farms had been depleted. That's one thing. He still has hopes also of maybe by terrorizing northern farms and citizens, weakening the northern resolve for this fight. Now, in actuality, stealing somebody's horse or stealing somebody's cows and pigs and, trampling on their crops, that's actually going to make a lot of Northerners even more firm in their resolve against the Confederacy. So that kind of backfires. And then 3, Lee also is getting a little desperate here. He's kind of getting boxed in. This is maybe one last gambit to try to assure Britain and any other potential European allies that the South was for real. This could be, again, like maybe the Saratoga that would push forth a European alliance. And that was mostly dashed by this point anyway, because of the Emancipation Proclamation. But he had hopes. And Lee was nothing if not an ambitious general. Okay, he's a very aggressive general, and he's willing to take risks. And this was a big gamble. It's not going to pay off. Both armies meet in this little quiet town of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and it's fought over 3 days. Like I said, at the end, not only the next day, July 4th, you have the victory of Gettysburg for the Union, but you're also going to have news coming from the West of the victory at Vicksburg, control of the Mississippi, the splitting of the South. So this is a huge moment, turning point for the Civil War. One of the most famous episodes during the 3 days of the fighting at Gettysburg, the bloody, bloody fighting of Gettysburg, was Pickett's charge, where General George Pickett, sent by General Lee with his force of about 13,000 Confederates, was supposed to charge up this gently sloping hill up to the northern defenses. And Pickett, by the way, mostly is hiding behind a barn during this charge. All of the division leaders get killed, and over half of the 13,000 men just get slaughtered by Union artillery and firearms while they're going up this hill towards the northern defense. So Pickett's charge was extremely costly, and Lee at the end of it, he's like, "What happened? Where's my division?" And he's just horrified at what he did. He knew it was like his biggest mistake. This was General Robert E. Lee's biggest mistake of the war. Sending these guys up to their death, basically, in this long march up this hill. But he's asking Pickett's men, for forgiveness when they're scrambling back, those that had survived. He's like, "I'm so sorry, I did this. I am responsible. I did this. I'm so sorry. I led you to your deaths." He even asked Jeff Davis to accept his resignation. Jefferson Davis will not accept it. But after Lee's blunder here, his forces retreat, and Lincoln, he contacts after Chancellorsville, Thomas Hooker was fired, and then you got General Meade. So now it's Meade is the main Union general. So Lincoln contacts Meade as Lee's forces are retreating after their terrible defeat at Gettysburg. And by the way, I mean, it was not without cost. Over 50,000 casualties from the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle ever in American history of any war. And a lot of those deaths were on the Union side. So I mean, this was both sides, heavy casualties, but it was a definite Union victory. And as Lee's forces are retreating, Lincoln entreats General Meade, his Union general, "Go after him. Don't repeat the mistake that McClellan made after Antietam. We can not only have won this great battle, but we can end the war if you can go and capture Lee's army, get them before they get back to Confederate soil." Unfortunately, Meade sits around for about 3 days, licking his wounds before he moves. And by that point, Lee and his army had already crossed the Potomac down into Virginia. So why does it matter? Well, it ended the second invasion of the North by General Lee's Confederate Army. So that was important. What would have happened if Lee had won? Well, maybe some of his goals would have been realized. Two, it's going to, in conjunction with the Battle of Vicksburg, represent the major turning points. The Union force now is going to slowly be closing in on the Confederacy. It's all about, just as it was in the Texas Revolution, just as it was in the American Revolution, it's not about Richmond, it's not about the capitals, it's about getting their army, capturing their military. If you defeat the Confederate military and you capture it, then you have won the war. And so we'll be closing in on them. And Confederates' chances after Gettysburg are little to none. And then, of course, Abraham Lincoln is going to give his most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address that I read earlier, in the fall after this, to commemorate the many dead soldiers that had died there. And there is the cemetery today, the battlefield cemetery. The battlefield itself is an amazing place to go and visit if you ever get a chance. Go to Gettysburg. All right, so these hallowed dead shall not have died in vain. With that, we're going to go ahead and stop there. I anticipate probably one more lecture, and then we will be done with 1301. Thank you, guys. Bye.